So good morning, welcome everyone. Today we are continuing with Tonglen, the practice of sending and receiving, one of the major trainings in compassion in the Mahayana tradition. So first I want to review where we are, and then I will give instructions on the final two sections, and then we will practice the complete sequence. So to describe Tonglen, we could say it is a way of abiding in a compassionate open-heartedness in whatever situation you encounter, so that our response is always this compassionate open-heartedness. And we're training ourselves to make this practice so familiar that we practice a mindfulness in which sending and receiving, or Tonglen, rides the breath. The formal cushion practice of Tonglen has four steps. First, we flash on our inherent bodhicitta, and we do that by first going into shamatha and then dropping the attention to the breath and just letting instructions fall away, and forever, how briefly, touching a moment of openness. This is just a flash, and it may not be your experience yet, but we're creating the circumstances for it. The second step is an abstract sending and receiving. So we're learning how to be present in our life without bypassing suffering, without moving away from suffering, without rejecting suffering. And in the same way, we're opening to the joy in our life and giving that away. So in the abstract qualities, we're visualizing breathing in something that's uncomfortable. Could be dense, dusty, oily, odorous, hot, however you want to imagine it. It's not about a story, it's just in a feeling tone before you start narrating the feeling, taking in and seeing the response of wanting to move away from suffering, and then sending out a freshness, a openness, something that cuts through that imagined dense, oily, hot, etc. The third practice is imagining a situation that's very close to your heart, where you would have a natural response to the suffering of wanting to relieve that being or that person of the burden that they're carrying. Breathing that in and exhaling what you see as relief or relieving that suffering. So again, it's not about constructing a story or solving a problem. It's creating this openness and presence and receptivity and response. And then the fourth step is making that universal. So you take the situation that's close to your heart. You may have a loved one that's ill or confused or experience some sort of difficulty, and your instinctual compassion leaps towards, if I could take that away from you, I would carry it for you. And then breathing out, a hug, warm cup of coffee. So we're taking that situation and making it universal. Moving from what's close to our hearts, may all beings who are suffering in this way, may they all be relieved of suffering, taking that in and breathing out a relief. So at this particular stage, we're not really thinking of physical suffering. And I think it's considered very rare that there's such a great practitioner that they can actually take on a physical suffering, relieving it. But we're imagining the suffering of the one that is dear to us, and we're taking in their emotional, confused, fearful, rigid, their mental state, the suffering aspect of their physical condition. And we're breathing out, again, not problem solving, not constructing a story, but an instinctual, if I could give you a hug, if I could bring you flowers, if I could give you a warm cup of coffee, a pat on the back, some spontaneous response, not a story. And what we're watching is how our thoughts and fears cause that inherent, open-hearted, compassionate aspect of our heart-mind to shut down. And then how do we soften and open? And how do we soften and open in degrees so that our capacity can take in not only our dear one, but everyone who's suffering in just the same way. So we haven't yet talked so much about the sending out. We've talked a little bit about the receiving, but not the giving. And if we think about our own habitual patterns, how we are conditioned by habits of thousands of lifetimes, by the experiences we've had from our childhood until now, there are layers and layers and layers of protection, and there are layers of wanting comfort, wanting security, and just wanting. So we could say this is the condition of samsara, the realm that we're living in, pushing away suffering and wanting anything that relieves the suffering and keeps us safe. So in the same way, in the last class, when we were saying, well, gee, if I just even imagine a leaf blower, it's hard for me to breathe. So there's a sense of how immediately and instinctual it is to leave that openness and contract. Similarly, for many people, it's just as difficult to give. I have to laugh here in Maine. Periodically you go for walks on the beach, and you might, on the whole stretch of beach, pick up one little rock or one little shell, and then all of a sudden that rock or shell is imbued with the memories of the day, the people you're with, how nice it felt, and it's, oh my goodness, this is my precious rock, and I'm going to put it on my altar, and I'm going to save it forever. So, if someone came up to you and said, oh, that rock is really pretty, can I have it? You go, no. And there's a whole beach full of rocks. Shantideva, in his wisdom, in the Bodhisattva's way of life, talks about when it's difficult to unconditionally give, practice with an ordinary stone, just giving it from your right hand to your left hand. So the training is also very much about giving. How can you release any attachment, clinging to even the imagined object that you're giving, and give it wholly, unconditionally, with no regret? So there's the instruction later that you should never give. The great bodhisattvas were able to give parts of their bodies, it said, but the instruction is you should never give any part of your body until you can give it like it's a cabbage. And in India, cabbage was like zucchinis are here, the most common, least valuable vegetable. So not even giving away that rock that you collected on the beach until you can give it like a cabbage. So you can give it just with the expression of, may this bring you comfort, may this bring you peace of mind. Not, oh, I'm not sure if I can give it, I might want to see it tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the sending, the responsive sending is also a practice of transparency. So with these two practices, we're seeing that we have the ideal of wanting to be compassionate, generous, accessible in the suffering of others. And as soon as we get caught up in ourselves, then we shut down that sincere instinctual responsiveness. And then as we try and grow, we see how the giving sometimes can be conditional, sometimes can be hesitant, sometimes can be transactional, that there are layers of emotional let's say stickiness. So we're not just giving unreservedly, there's a kind of stickiness to our giving, and we want to be transparent towards that. So with the whole practice, two simultaneous things are working upon our system. Let's say two different kinds of medicines. On the one hand, we're seeing exactly where we are, what is the nature of our freedom from clinging or attachment to clinging, and what is the level of our need for security and protection versus openness and open-heartedness. And at the same time, we are developing habits of stronger and stronger generosity and stronger compassion. So the training in compassion and generosity is increasing, and the habit of clinging, attachment, and self-absorption is getting smaller. So you could see it like that, the pictures of justice with the scales. So generosity and compassion is getting stronger, and the self-clinging, self-absorption is getting less and less and less. So it's good to know why we're practicing this and how we're practicing this and what's happening while we're practicing this, because it keeps us from getting sidetracked. When we start to build the narrative or start to problem solve, that's getting sidetracked. That's getting more and more conceptual. So we're not trying to become more conceptual. We're trying to become less conceptual and moving beyond the need for a narrative or a story into an open-heartedness. So we're watching our open-heartedness, whether we're receiving or sending, expand and contract. And as we grow with this, when we mature as bodhisattvas, then there will come a time when we're able to give more and more. And there'll come a time with the great ones that there's a direct as opposed to a visualized effect. So one of the stories from, I think, Words of My Perfect Teacher is Patrul Rinpoche going to see one of the great teachers of his time. And on the outskirts of the crowd, somebody threw a rock at a dog to keep the dog away. And he could hear the dog sort of squeal. And then later, Patrul Rinpoche had a bruise appear on his hip at the same body part where the dog had been hit. So this teacher had the capacity to actually physically work with Tonglen. But we're working with just where we are. So a story like this is meant to inspire you, not to discourage you. So we'll go fairly quickly through the first two steps, which we practiced fairly in depth, and then we'll go to the following two steps. So let's sit for a couple of minutes and just let our minds settle, following the breath. You can put your attention on the breath. Now let the effort of that attention just drop, any thoughts dissolving, and your experience of just letting go into spaciousness. So this is the basis or the foundation, this inner spaciousness, reminding us that we can sit in boundlessness and anything can arise and dissolve in boundlessness. So the second step, imagining something dry, dusty, hot, odorous, oily, dense, smoky. Just choose one that seems like it would be a texture that would be slightly uncomfortable, breathing in that, and giving back fresh, spacious, open. And just notice the mind-body experience. Does your body stiffen? Do your muscles start to contract with discomfort? And how is that different from the open spaciousness? Keeping the breath even, the same amount of in-breath and out-breath. And tasting just a tiny bit of fearlessness. That discomfort can resolve itself during the in-breath. And the out-breath can be even more expansive. Now moving to the third step, using an image as just a switch to turn on the fear or the contraction so you can see it for what it is. So we're imagining someone close to our heart, children, relative, animal, plant, a being experiencing difficulty. And this, it's important that this is something very close to your heart, where you just have an instinctive, I would take this off your shoulders if I could. Beloved, if I could just, even for a minute, take this off your shoulders. So that switch of seeing a loved one suffering and your compassion opening, and then breathing that in, and then experiencing, being transparent with yourself of how quickly fear arises, even when it's a situation close to your heart, or a layer of contraction, whatever your experience is. We want to be able to see how dominant the habit of protection is. And then breathing out, just again, an image like a flash to turn on that instinctual generosity. Talanka gave me some delicious tea, so I can just remember sipping this yummy tea and, sending out that feeling of how comforting a warm cup of tea is. So we're not problem solving, we're not making a narrative. We're using an image or a situation as a switch to breathe in fearlessly and breathe out generously. And we're seeing how our response is complicated. Let's just say it's complicated. Again, learning about it, letting it soften and resolve, learning about the giving, letting it soften and resolve it. So we'll spend a few minutes on the situation that is very close to our hearts. If you've ever had a plant in your house and you haven't watered it, so you see a struggling plant, that's another easy, more or less neutral situation. So we're looking at how fully open we can be, even when we have the intellectual aspiration to shoulder the burden of a loved one. Then when we try and take it in, what are the layers of protection that start to arise? And as we're visualizing that loved one, we can relax our body and relax our mind, opening just a little further than we were able to open yesterday. So now expanding the situation, breathing in a group of people who are in the same situation, a general universal quality of all beings who are in the same situation. Making it larger, more universal. And breathing out with that same unreserved offering. You might move to 2 neighbors. You might move to a whole nursing home. You might move to every old person in the country. You're looking at your own rate of speed of expansion, seeing where fear enters the picture, contraction enters the picture, and right in that moment, allowing everything to dissolve into spaciousness, back to that openness, breathing in and offering. And then completing the sequence, it's good to sit again for a few minutes. Let all thoughts drop away. So one way to think about offering the body is to think of Pope Francis right now, who we hear is hospitalized with pneumonia, and how he gave so much of his time and energy to his worldwide congregation. So thoughts of his own, so let's say protecting his body, became less and less important than seeing the suffering and giving the words of wisdom that were needed by people who are suffering. So there are lots of ways to think about the maturing of Tonglen.